His name was Thomas Reeves, and he was not the kind of person who ended up in Jim Morrison's life. He was 41 years old in 1969, a former high school English teacher from Pasadena who had left teaching 3 years earlier after a divorce that had rearranged everything he had believed to be stable about his circumstances, and who was now doing something he described, in the conversations that have been partially reconstructed from the accounts of mutual acquaintances, as trying to figure out what comes next. He read constantly. He went to concerts when he could afford to, which was not always. He was not a musician, not a writer, not an industry person of any kind, not someone who moved in the circles that Jim Morrison moved in or who would, under any ordinary arrangement of circumstances, have found himself in the same room as one of the most recognizable cultural figures of the late 1960s. And then in the summer of 1969, through a chain of social connections so casual and so indirect that it seems, in retrospect, almost accidentally constructed, he was introduced to Jim Morrison at a party in the Hollywood Hills, and they talked for 4 hours, and Jim Morrison called him the following week, and Thomas Reeves spent the next 18 months in the strange and asymmetrical position of being the closest friend of a person who was, to the rest of the world, a myth. The friendship has been difficult to document because Thomas Reeves was deeply reluctant to document it. He gave one interview in his life in 1994 to a researcher named Patricia Holloway, who had spent years tracking the peripheral figures of Jim Morrison's final American period, and he gave it on the condition that large sections of it would not be published during his lifetime. He died in 2003, and the portions he had withheld were released in the following years, slowly and with the care of someone honoring a condition they take seriously. What emerged from the full interview was a portrait of a friendship that was unusual in every respect that friendships with famous people are usually unusual, and also unusual in ways that those friendships rarely are, unusual in the quality of what it demanded from both parties and in the quality of what it produced. The interview is an unusual document. It lacks the performative quality of most celebrity-adjacent memoirs, the tendency to inflate proximity into something larger than it was. Thomas Reeves spoke about Jim Morrison, the way people speak about friends they have genuinely known, with specific detail and the appropriate uncertainty of someone who was only one side of a two-sided experience. He said repeatedly that he could not speak for what Jim had gotten from the friendship, only for what it had been from where he was standing. Jim Morrison called Thomas Reeves the week after the party because Thomas had argued with him. This was, by Jim's own account, as Reeves later described it, sufficiently rare in his daily experience of 1969 to be worth a follow-up phone call. The argument was about a poem, not Jim's poem, but a poem by Rimbaud that they had been discussing, and Thomas had said something about the poem that contradicted what Jim had said about it, not provocatively or with any awareness of who he was contradicting, but simply because he believed what he was saying and the contradiction seemed worth making. Jim had not agreed with the contradiction, but he had found it interesting, which was a quality that the conversations of that period, surrounded as he was by people who, for various reasons related to his fame and his volatility and his capacity for displeasure, had developed a default toward agreement, had been substantially lacking. Thomas had no investment in Jim Morrison agreeing with him. He had a strong investment in the quality of the disagreement, in whether the positions being taken were based on actual engagement with the material rather than on the social dynamics of the conversation. He had spent his adult life in arguments about texts and ideas, and had learned through that experience that the argument was where the thinking happened, and the thinking was the point. This was, in the context of Jim Morrison's 1969 social life, a genuinely unusual quality, and Jim Morrison recognized it as unusual almost immediately. The friendship that developed between them across the summer and autumn of 1969 and into the winter of 1970 was, by Thomas's account, primarily a friendship of conversation. They met at Thomas's apartment, a modest place in Silver Lake, nothing that suited the mythology of Jim Morrison's life, or occasionally in parks or coffee shops, in the ordinary settings of a friendship between people who are meeting to talk rather than to be seen somewhere together. Jim did not bring handlers or friends or any of the apparatus that accompanied his public life. He arrived as he was, which was, according to Thomas, consistently different from the person who occupied the cultural conversation about Jim Morrison in those years. More attentive, quieter, more genuinely curious about the specifics of other people's inner lives and less interested in producing statements about his own. More, in a word. That Thomas used several times in the interview, ordinary. They argued about Rimbaud. They argued about William Blake and about what Blake's mysticism was actually doing in his poems and whether it required belief in the literal content of the imagery to function as poetry. They argued about film. Thomas had seen almost everything at the revival theaters in Lowe's Angels and had opinions about directors that he expressed with the same directness he brought to his opinions about literature. They argued about teaching and what it had done to Thomas and what it had failed to do and whether the failure was teaching's failure or his. The conversations about teaching were, Thomas said in the interview, the ones that surprised him most in retrospect. He had expected Jim to be interested in the literary and philosophical material that was the common ground that had produced the initial conversation. He had not expected Jim to be so genuinely interested in the experience of teaching, in what it felt like to be responsible for bringing other people into contact with material they did not yet understand. Jim had found this, the conditions for understanding, the limits of transmission, the question of what a teacher could actually do as opposed to what they hoped to do, genuinely fascinating. Thomas understood later that Jim was thinking about performance, about what he could and could not transmit to an audience and what the audience's experience of a performance actually consisted of and whether the thing he intended to transmit was the thing they received. They argued more than once about what Jim Morrison was doing with his life. This was an argument that Jim initiated, and Thomas engaged with it because he was not the kind of person who avoided an argument because the subject might be difficult. Thomas said, in the 1994 interview, that Jim had told him once that the most valuable thing about their conversations was that Thomas was not trying to get anything from them. That everyone else in Jim's life was trying to get something. The band needed something, the label needed something, the fans needed something, the critics and journalists needed something, the people who attached themselves to his proximity needed the proximity itself, and that the accumulation of needing had produced, in Jim's daily experience, a quality of constant transaction that had become exhausting in a way that was difficult to communicate to anyone who had not experienced it at that scale and intensity. Thomas needed nothing from Jim Morrison except the conversation he had been having. Conversations of similar quality with people who could give him nothing at all, and the quality was what he was there for. Jim recognized this. He returned to it every few days or every week, with the regularity of someone returning to a thing that is necessary. What Thomas saw in Jim Morrison across those 18 months was something he spent considerable time in the interview trying to describe accurately. He said that the public version of Jim Morrison, the leather jacket, the mythological persona, the figure of excess and transgression that the press had assembled and that Jim had, to varying degrees of intention, participated in assembling was not false. It was a genuine part of the person, but it was a part that had been amplified by the conditions of fame to a scale that had progressively obscured the parts alongside it, the part that sat in Thomas's apartment and argued about Rimbaud, the part that was genuinely interested in whether Thomas had ever read Malcolm Lowry and what he thought about Under the Volcano, the part that was frightened, not in the large existential theatrical way, but in the ordinary human way of someone who has gone somewhere very fast without fully choosing the direction and who now finds themselves somewhere unfamiliar and is not certain what the next step should be. This observation, the most visible part of myself, the inability to find the rest, was the most accurate description Thomas had ever heard of what had happened to Jim Morrison in the years of fame. The Jim Morrison who had arrived at the Hollywood Hills party and argued about Rimbaud had been, in the 2 years preceding their meeting, progressively occupied by the demands of being a figure of cultural significance. At the scale the Doors had achieved, the occupation was not simple. It was a matter of the most visible part, the performer, the myth, the stage, expanding to fill more of the available interior space through the ordinary mechanics of living a life in which the most visible part was what everyone responded to. Thomas said that the closest Jim ever came to naming the fear directly was in a conversation in the autumn of 1970, a few months before Jim's departure for Paris. He said Jim had said something, and Thomas was careful to say this was his reconstruction of the words, not a verbatim report, along the lines of, "I think I've become the most visible part of myself, and now I can't find the rest." What Thomas saw in Jim Morrison across those 18 months was something he spent considerable time trying to describe accurately. He said Jim had been moving toward something in the Paris months, and the June phone call had sounded like the beginning of an arrival, that the searching had seemed for the first time to be getting somewhere, that the question Jim had been circling had been showing signs of being findable, and that the finding had been interrupted before it could be completed. Thomas said he had thought about this for 20 years before agreeing to the interview. He had thought about whether speaking about it publicly was a violation of what the friendship had been. He had concluded that speaking about it carefully, in the way that honored what the friendship had actually been rather than what the mythology needed it to be, was not a violation but a form of completion. The thing Jim had been trying to find was the thing the interview was trying to describe. Thomas Reeves did not know when Jim left for Paris in March 1971 that he was saying goodbye. Jim had told him he was going and that he would be back, and Thomas had believed him or had chosen to believe him. They had spoken on the phone twice after Jim's departure, once in April and once in June. He sounded, Thomas said, like he was getting somewhere. He sounded like the Paris mornings were doing what he had hoped they would do. He sounded more like himself, which was the word Thomas used to mean more like the person who had sat in the Silver Lake apartment arguing about Blake than like the person on the magazine covers. Thomas Reeves learned about Jim Morrison's death from the radio while driving in July 1971. He pulled over, he sat with it for a while, and then he drove home and did not speak about the friendship publicly for 23 years. He said the reason for the silence was not grief only. The reason was that the friendship had been, for both of them, one of the few spaces in Jim's final American years that had nothing to do with what Jim Morrison meant to the culture. That the conversations had been private in the specific sense of being genuinely between two people rather than between a public figure and a private citizen. And that speaking about them publicly would alter that quality retroactively, would make the friendship into a story about Jim Morrison, which it had never been while it was happening. When Thomas finally agreed to the interview with Patricia Holloway, it was because he had concluded that enough time had passed for the telling to be about the thing rather than about the fame. He said that he wanted people to understand that Jim Morrison, in the final 2 years of his American life, had been capable of and hungry for exactly the kind of ordinary, demanding, unsentimental friendship that the mythology of his life made it almost impossible to imagine him having. That the leather jacket had not prevented the argument about Rimbaud, that the magazine covers had not replaced the need for a conversation partner who would not simply agree. That the person who had sat in Thomas's apartment all those evenings was the same person who performed for thousands, and was also the part of that person that the performance could never quite reach. Thomas said at the end of the interview that Jim Morrison was, in his private life, exactly as serious as the best of his work suggests. That the intelligence and the searching and the genuine engagement with ideas that showed up in the poems and the performances was not constructed for an audience. It was the actual interior life of the person operating without an audience in the ordinary conditions of a Tuesday evening in Silver Lake with coffee and an argument about a French poet. The audience came to the concerts. The interior life came to Thomas's apartment. And the interior life, the one that showed up in the Silver Lake apartment, was the source of everything the audience came to the concerts to receive. Thomas said that the mythology, while not false, was missing the seriousness. That the story the culture told was about excess and transgression and the beautiful disaster of a life lived at too high an intensity. That this story was true as far as it went but did not go far enough. That the person who had sat in the Silver Lake apartment arguing about Blake with a former high school English teacher from Pasadena was not a beautiful disaster. He was a serious person engaged in serious work, and the serious work had not been finished, and the not finishing was the real loss. He kept no letters. Jim had not been a letter writer. He kept no recordings of their conversations, which had happened before he understood that they were the kind of conversations that 20 years later he would wish he had recorded. He kept, he said, the arguments themselves, the specific shape of the disagreements, and the specific quality of Jim's attention when a disagreement was happening. What Thomas Reeves provided, in refusing to speak for 23 years and then speaking carefully, was the most accurate available account of what Jim Morrison was like as a private person, which is to say, as a person, not as a cultural figure. As a person who showed up at a modest apartment in Silver Lake on Tuesday evenings to argue about French poetry with a former high school teacher who had no particular reason to be impressed by him and who was not. The quality those conversations described, the seriousness, the attention, the genuine curiosity, is still available in the music and the poetry for anyone willing to listen past the mythology and hear what the serious person was actually trying to say.